Hello, I am Professor Shladya Rakshit, Origin and Development of IHL, History and Philosophy. Let us take the module overview. This module traces the history and development of international humanitarian law. It explains the philosophical background of the principles that are now prevalent in the law and how they have developed into these codified principles as we know them. Further, we must also look into the learning outcomes. First, to introduce students to international humanitarian law and its historical background. Second, to trace its development and contemporary status. Third, to understand the scope of the international humanitarian law. Let us go into the introduction of international humanitarian law. The law of armed conflict, or LOAC, has two important elements. The first part, jus ad bellum, regulates the use of force. The legitimacy and justification of using force against another's sovereign is covered by principles of jus ad bellum. International humanitarian law, or IHL, or jus in bello, are principles of international law which seek to limit the impacts of violence caused during an armed conflict, i.e., after force is used. The focus of IHL is restricted to only conduct of states during an armed conflict and does not regulate when a state may use force. It can be understood in a very simple way. Jus ad bellum answers the question of when force can be used, while jus in bello answers how force can be used. There are two principal branches of IHL that are described as Hague Law, involving the regulation of weaponry and the selection of military targets, and Geneva Law, covering the treatment of POWs or prisoners of war, detainees, civilians and humanitarian aid workers. With a century worth of expansion, international humanitarian law, or IHL, has developed into a comprehensive body of rules which work to ensure that damage of an armed conflict is least possible, especially on the innocent civilians. Even though IHL was formally introduced in late early 1860s, its rules can be found ingrained in ancient civilizations and religions. This chapter will trace back the history of IHL to explain how it had reached in a point where it stands now. The philosophical origin of international humanitarian law or IHL. The history of IHL can be traced far back ancient time when war was permissible. Traditional forms of humanitarian principles were governed solely by humanity. Vague sense of morality guided the complainants about behavior between themselves and towards the innocent non-combatants. Then what are the principles of IHL? The principles of IHL were particularly visible in ancient Indian and Greek culture, while they had also made their space in the rising religions such as Islam and Christianity. The war of the Mahabharata can be seen as one of the earliest source of principles of humanitarian law. One of the crucial principles that originated from the Mahabharata was that of dharma yuddha, or the principle of righteous war. Many practices such as stopping hostilities at sunset or not attacking the unarmed, which were discussed in the Mahabharata, are still prevalent in the contemporary humanitarian law. The other instances from within the discussion of the text of the war set the stage for international humanitarian law doctrines to step in. For instance, Arjuna's decision to refrain from using ultra destructive weapon in conventional war would latter be formulated in prohibiting of use of certain weapons in a war. The Indian Manusmriti and the Rig Veda lay down elaborate principles of war, including prohibition of concealed, poisoned or barbed weapons, engagement in honest duel, different treatment for unmounted or innocent people who do not wish to engage in battle, and humane treatment of the combat prisoners and civilians in conquered territories. The Greek goddess Athena was considered a protectress who could engaged in civilized combat for just causes. Reference made to Athena compare her wisdom and at the same time thoughtfulness to Ares, who was a bloodthirsty, unrestrained god. Islam was not oblivious to humanitarian principles either. It had requirements such as women, old and children ought not to be killed. There are texts that support the theory that Islam also disallowed destruction of houses, fields or livestock. With the Renaissance, the notion of civilized or civilization entered the belief system of people. One of the major contributions to IHL in Europe was the Church's just war doctrine. Now, what was the just war doctrine? Which also encompassed the justices of resorting to force. The motivation for restraint in behavior during war stemmed from notions of what was considered to be honorable, and in the 19th century in particular what was perceived as civilized. Now, for example, for a combatant to attack an unarmed person would cause a loss of honor and respect. There were efforts made in spirit of humanity including treatment of sick soldiers and liberation of prisoners following the religious sentiments. This backing made the principles more welcome and acceptable as compared to the other domains of international law. This is probably why, when theorists started discussing this matter, they received majority appreciation, and this appreciation is for introducing the much needed principles, and these principles on international humanitarian law. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his Social Contract Theory 1762, reflected on the abysmal conditions of prisoners of war and the wounded. He argued that the prisoners or the wounded should not be further exposed to reciprocal attacks of belligerents. Rousseau's theory could be considered one of the first attempts to pen down the humanitarian principles that existed in the society. During the 1800s, many individuals recognized the importance of a formal institution for humanitarian principles and actively started applying them. However, these aspirations of those noble spirits did not materialize until the 1860s. It was then and when until Henry Dunant gave the most effective impulse for a new organization with his most celebrated contribution, that is, Un Sovereign di Solferino in 1862, Codification of International Humanitarian Law. The IHL regime was first formalized at Geneva Convention in 1863 with the establishment of the Red Cross Committee. This sudden interest in humanitarian law was a result of a ferocious battle of Solferino in 1859, which provoked people like Henry Dunant and many others like him to fight for humanitarian law and humane treatment of combatants as well as non-combatants. Let us now look into the Battle of Solferino and the role played by Henry Dunant. The Battle of Solferino is marked as one of the most crucial battles in history between the French allied to the Sardinians and the Austrian troops. By the end of the day, more than 6,000 dead and 40,000 wounded soldiers were scattered on the field. The situations seemed dire for the French and the Sardinians, as they had very few doctors and no means of transportation. A small portion of the wounded made their way to a nearby village and found aid from Henry Dunant and other locals. Disturbed by the entire experience, Henry Dunant wrote an account of the war in his popular work, A Memory of Solferino, 1862, where he described or penned down the nightmare he went through. Dunant's contribution managed to stir the conscience of the world and led to the conference in Geneva. which laid the foundations of the international organization that is now called the International Committee of Red Cross. In his book, Dunant proposed two ideas for alleviating the suffering of soldiers, viz. Creation of relief society to supplement army medical service and a legal basis that would oblige armies to take care of all wounded soldiers irrespective of their side. Then let us look at the St. Petersburg Declaration, the Labour Code and the First Geneva Convention. Where on one hand humanitarian movement in Europe was gaining support, United States was caught in the midst of a civil war. During the American Civil War, President Lincoln issued a code to the military which got popular as the Lieber Code, named after Dr. Francis Lieber, who drafted the code. The Lieber Code was a set of instructions laid down for the US forces, which represented an accurate picture of the humanitarian principles and custom existing at that time. Some of the key features of the Lieber Code involve principles of humanity and military necessity at the time of war. However, Geneva Convention of 1864 is recognized as the premier formal codification of the international humanitarian law. The first Geneva Convention had 10 articles and broadly dealt with the conditions of the wounded in armies in the field. It declared ambulances, military hospitals, including personnel services in them, and accommodation, as well as accommodating the wounded and the sick, as neutral parties. The convention allowed for these parties to carry on their functions even at the time of war, along with protection to inhabitants who had helped the wounded combatants. Additionally, it required the wounded or sick combatants to be collected and cared for irrespective of their nation. It ensured that the damage and loss of life was not further aggravated by miseries of the wounded. Moreover, it managed to address all the concerns that Henry Dunant had raised with respect to treatment of wounded soldiers. The Geneva Convention of 1864 also came up with uniform flag for an armlet bearing a red cross on a white ground. The 1864 convention marked as the origin of the formal humanitarian principles, which were built upon by the international community in the following century. Another important instrument that developed parallel to the first Geneva Convention and Lieber Code was the St. Petersburg Declaration, deviating from the protection of targets of war. The St. Petersburg Declaration focused on the weapons that can be used for war. Adopted in 1868, it was the first formal agreement to prohibit use of certain kinds of weapons. The declaration, which was provoked by the invention of exploding bullets, confirmed the customary rule, and according to which the use of arms projectiles and materials of a nature to cause unnecessary suffering is prohibited. It defined winning the war as the only justified military objective. The Declaration of St. Petersburg prompted the adoption of further declarations of a similar nature at the two Hague Peace Conferences of 1899 and 1907. The Hague Declarations relating to discharge of projectiles and explosives from balloons, the use of asphyxiating gases and the use of expanding bullets refer in their preambles to the extent of the Declaration of St. Petersburg. Then we come to development of IHL principles thereon, and the early years of IHL and the Hague Conventions. The first Hague Peace Convention was convened in 1899 on initiative of Tsar Nicholas II with the objective of spreading peace and limiting development of armaments, though it failed to achieve its primary objection or objective of reduction of armaments. It did manage to usher the era of arms control. The first Hague Conference saw three conventions, viz. The Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes of July 29, 1899. The Convention respective to the laws and customs of war on land of July 29, 1899, and the Convention for the adoption to maritime warfare of the principles of the Geneva Convention of July 29, 1899 formalized. The Hague Conference of 1907 resulted in 13 new conventions with regard to the similar subject matter. Some of the major principles that could be observed in the Hague Conventions were prohibition on targets, the Hague Convention on Law and Customs of War, on land, established defined rules to limit the kinds of targets of attack and the weapons that could be used. For example, attacks on cultural property or undefended towns were strictly prohibited. The prohibition on weapons. The Hague Regulations banned use of arms, material or projectiles designed to cause unnecessary suffering. Some of the explicit examples of the weapons banned at that time included the infamous dum-dum bullets, irregularly shaped projectiles of those that would inflame a wound. The humane treatment and the rights of prisoners of war, where the Geneva Convention 1864 had laid down the principles for treatment of wounded and sick. The Hague Conventions or the Hague Regulations rather brought in substantial rules regarding humane treatment and rights of prisoners of war. Human treatment for civilians and non-combatants, special status for neutral parties, civilians and non-combatants was as follows, and it was re-emphasized by the Hague Conventions with regards to laws of war. It is to be noted that the Hague Conventions did not have the quantitative support in order to be successful and were followed by the disastrous world wars. The events of the world wars displayed complete disregard of the Hague Conventions or the principles, making them redundant. However, after the disastrous effects witnessed by the First War, the Hague Rules gained more attention. By 1939, these rules gained recognition from all civilizations and civilized nations and were regarded as declaratory of the existing customary laws. Now, let us look into the topic of international humanitarian law and the world wars. The humanitarian principles developed over a period were put to a test during the world wars. In 1914, when the first war started, ICRC was already working for prisoners of wars along with focus on civilians and healthcare. Even though the Hague regulations had rules protecting civilians in occupied territories, civilians had to bear the burden of the wars from both western and eastern fronts. Both the fronts ignored most of the humanitarian principles laid down in Geneva and the Hague Conventions. Another concern that had not been anticipated before the war was the widespread use of poison gases during the war. As a result of First World War, there were more diplomatic attempts to find a solution. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol for the prohibition of the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases and of bacteriological methods of warfare was introduced. Soon after, diplomats met again in 1929 to come up with the better defined rules of with respect to the treatment of prisoners of war and wounded and sick. But before the effect of the First War could sink in, World War II, which was even more deadly and broke out. Heavy civilian casualties in the war resulting from bombardment and genocide policies. There was deportation and mass murder as well as taking hostages, directed the attention of the international community on the need for civilian protection. The aftermath of the world wars shook the conscience of the world. It is to be noted of the world population, the need to evaluate and rethink war experiences was a concern shared by all nations. This set the stage for the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which accumulated principles of humanitarian law that existed and at the same time created a new body of conventions that were accepted by almost all the nations. Then you have the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and additional protocols. The 1949 Geneva Convention resulted in 4 new revised conventions comprising of 429 articles. These 4 conventions included A. Convention for the amelioration of conditions of wounded and sick in armed forces in the field, Convention 2 for the amelioration of conditions of wounded, sick and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, Convention 3 relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and Convention 4 relative to the protection of civilian persons in times of war. In 1977, the international community came up with the two additional protocols which dealt with protecting of victims of international and non-international armed conflicts in order to supplement the Geneva Conventions. Even though each of the conventions dealt with specific subject matter, there were certain general principles of humanity common to all of them. For instance, all of them have identical provisions with regards to prohibition of murder, torture, mutilation and outrages upon personal dignity, taking hostage, pillages and inhumane treatment. The unanimous acceptance of Geneva Convention 1949 resulted in a strengthened mechanism, and the strengthened mechanism for humanitarian principles, which had a binding force on all countries. Now, let us look at the contemporary international humanitarian law. Even though Geneva Convention of 1949 served as the beginning of the contemporary international humanitarian law, it certainly did not mark the end of it. IHL principles have been in a state of constant evolution even after the conventions have taken place. Various treaties have been negotiated by the states to ensure that the humanitarian principles are wide enough to accommodate the technological development otherwise taking place. Perfect instance of ideology can be seen in the Convention on Prohibition or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons. 1980, along with its 5 additional protocols which lay down regulations around the following kind of weapons protocol, which are the non-detectable fragments. Protocol 2 talks about mines, booby traps, other devices. Protocol 3 incendiary weapons. Protocol 4 blinding laser weapons. Protocol 5 explosive remnants of war. On a separate context, Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling and use of chemical weapons and on their destruction, 1993, attempts to tackle the chemical weapons to ensure enforceability and protection of civilians. Crimes such as genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes have been criminalized and form a crucial part of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The legal protection for children in armed conflict has received attention because of enraging figures of children involved in armed conflicts to tackle their participation in hostilities, and the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict was adopted in 2000. Humanitarian principles remain an ever evolving concept, and discussions on new conventions are constantly in discussion, with states taking responsibility to accept these principles. New developments and more towards a stronger regime are quite prominent. However, contemporary IHL suffers from certain major challenges. Modern period hardly experience any war between countries, with the emergence of terrorism, and for non-state actors a new form of warfare has emerged. This warfare can be best described by asymmetry. Those who are causing most suffering in the present scenario do not abide by the principles of IHL. This causes an asymmetry of morality. The challenges due to this now asymmetric warfare have caused many scholars to revisit the existing principles of IHL. Thus, in order to summarize this, in this module we learnt the meaning and scope of international humanitarian law. We traced the origin of IHL back to their philosophical existence in various religions, and discussed the transformation of vague principles into codified law. Further, we briefly learned about the basics of the two primary regimes of the IHL, viz. The Hague and the Geneva laws, and we discussed the implications of this world wars on the principles and development of the regime. Thereafter, towards the end of the module, we discussed the further developments of IHL to the current position and the emerging challenges it faces due to the changing trends of warfare. Thank you.